There are places in Scripture where the silence is almost louder than the speech. Genesis 6:1-4 is one of those places. The passage is short enough to read in less than a minute, yet it opens a wound in the early story of the world that never fully closes. Human beings multiply, daughters are born, the sons of God see, choose, and take. Then the text moves with startling speed toward judgment. It does not pause to satisfy curiosity. It does not explain every term. It does not unfold the scene in the measured detail many readers want. Instead, it leaves us standing at the edge of a mystery just before the floodwaters rise. That brevity is not accidental. Genesis often slows down when covenant is at stake and speeds up when human pride tries to make itself look permanent. Here, the camera of the text, if we may speak that way, does not linger on spectacle. It lingers on disorder. The emphasis is not on exotic beings for their own sake. The emphasis is on a boundary crossed, a creation pattern violated, and a human world sliding further into corruption. By the time verse 5 arrives, the Lord sees that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart is only evil continually. The 4 strange verses are not a detached curiosity. They are part of the moral weather system of the flood. That is one place where many retellings lose their footing. They build the whole story around hidden bloodlines, secret priestesses, or buried supernatural codes, and in doing so they shift attention away from what the biblical narrative actually presses to the front. The Bible is not mainly fascinated by arcane inheritance. It is concerned with rebellion, violence, and the grief of God over a world that has bent its gifts toward ruin. Even when later traditions expand this episode, the central problem remains the same. Heaven's order and earth's order are treated as material to be seized rather than received. The phrase sons of God has been debated for centuries. Some readers, both ancient and modern, take it to mean heavenly beings. Others argue that it refers to powerful human rulers, or to the godly line of Seth intermarrying with the ungodly line of Cain. The text itself does not settle every question in the plainest possible way, and that uncertainty is worth respecting. But one thing is clear regardless of which reading one prefers. The scene describes an abuse of order. Those with power see what they desire, take whom they desire, and leave behind a world more swollen with pride than before. Desire becomes rule, and rule becomes appetite. That pattern matters because it echoes earlier fractures in Genesis. Eve saw that the forbidden tree was desirable. Lamech multiplied violence into song. Babel would later seek a name that reached upward by force. In each case, the problem is not mere curiosity or ambition. It is the refusal to remain creaturely. It is the suspicion that limits assaults rather than protections. Genesis 6 belongs to that same current, whether the sons of God are read as angels, kings, or dynastic tyrants. The act is presented as one more attempt to overrun the place assigned by God. The strange mention of the Nephilim deepens the unease. They are there in those days, and also afterward. They are remembered as mighty men, men of renown. That phrase has a chill in it. Renown sounds admirable at first, but Genesis is a book that distrusts fame when fame is severed from faithfulness. The builders of Babel will soon say, "Let us make a name for ourselves." The Bible does not deny that the world produces impressive figures. It asks what kind of world their greatness serves. A name can be a gift from God, as it was for Abraham, or a monument built against God, as it was at Babel. The Nephilim belong to the second atmosphere. This is also why Enoch stands so near this passage in the genealogy before it. Genesis 5 says only that Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. It is one of the most compressed and luminous descriptions in all of Scripture. Amid generations marked by death, Enoch is remembered not for conquest, not for renown, not for secret arts, but for fellowship with God. That quiet testimony becomes important when later literature builds around his name. The contrast is easy to miss if we rush. On one side stands a world obsessed with force, fame, and transgression. On the other stands a man known for walking faithfully. There is another silence here that deserves attention. Genesis says almost nothing about the women involved, except that they were seen as beautiful and taken. Later imagination often turns them into seductresses, hidden initiates, or carriers of dangerous wisdom, but the canonical text does not dramatize them in that way. It tells the story from the angle of power, not allure. The daughters of men are not described as architects of rebellion, they are the human side of a taking. That matters morally. It keeps us from shifting blame onto a myth of feminine danger, when the text itself highlights a larger disorder in creation and authority. This restraint also protects us from a second error, treating every later legend about a mysterious woman of the night as if it were direct biblical history. Scripture is more exact than that. It has room for dark images, desert creatures, haunted ruins, and memories of judgment, but it does not flatten all those symbols into one secret lineage. A later tradition may preserve an echo, a fear, or an interpretation. It may even preserve a genuine ancient intuition. But echoes are not the same as evidence, and suggestive parallels are not the same as inspired explanation. So before we go any further, the question is not simply who these beings were. The deeper question is why the Bible places this fragment where it does. It stands between genealogy and flood like a hinge. It tells us that evil in Scripture is not only personal wrongdoing in the ordinary sense. Evil can become structural. It can infect desire, inheritance, power, memory, and culture. It can become admired. It can become old enough to feel normal. When that happens, judgment is no longer a random interruption. It becomes the severe mercy by which God refuses to let disorder define the world forever. That is where the story must begin. Not with sensational secrecy, but with a few difficult verses, a silence around motives the text does not fully explain, and a world nearing the point where water will speak, because humanity no longer listens. Chapter 2. The boundary crossed. If we stay close to Genesis 6, one verb bears much of the weight. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took wives from any they chose. The wording is unsettling because it sounds familiar. In Genesis, seeing and taking often signal desire, reaching past obedience. Eve saw and took. Achan in Joshua will later see and take what was forbidden. David will see Bathsheba, and what begins in sight will move toward ruin. The issue is not beauty itself. The issue is the conversion of beauty into possession. The line between gift and seizure is crossed so quickly that the text hardly has to comment. That is why the old interpretation that reads these sons of God as heavenly beings has endured. In the wider biblical world, the phrase can refer to members of a heavenly court, as in Job. Later Jewish tradition clearly read Genesis this way, and the Book of 1, Enoch, became one of the fullest expansions of that reading. In that literature, a company of watchers descends, binds itself by oath, takes women, fathers giants, and teaches humanity forbidden arts. Some of those details do not appear in Genesis itself, so they should not be treated as if they were equal to the canonical text. Yet they show how ancient readers tried to explain why such a brief biblical passage felt so charged. Other interpreters resist the angelic reading, and not without reason. Jesus says in the Gospels that angels in heaven do not marry. Some church fathers and many later readers concluded that Genesis 6 must instead describe human intermarriage, perhaps between the line of Seth and the line of Cain, or between tyrannical rulers and the women they seized. That reading has the advantage of keeping the passage within the plain social violence of human history. It also highlights something undeniably biblical. Men with power often act as though desire grants permission. The result is still corruption, even if no supernatural crossing is involved. The debate is real, and it should not be hidden under confidence that the text itself does not grant. Some scholars argue that the earliest audience likely heard sons of God as divine beings. Others maintain that the final canonical form of Genesis is more interested in human wickedness than in angelic speculation. Both observations have force. The passage may preserve an older memory, while placing it inside a narrative whose theological center is the moral collapse of humanity. In other words, the strangeness is not there to distract from sin. It is there to show how far sin may reach when order breaks down. If the angelic reading is allowed, even as a possibility, then the moral shape of the story becomes especially sharp. The problem is not romance between worlds. It is revolt against distinction. Genesis 1 is built on separations that make life possible. Light from darkness, sea from land, day from night, creature after kind, humanity as humanity before God. Genesis 6 then presents a confusion of spheres. Something that should remain ordered under God reaches across a limit and turns another domain into an object of appetite. The offense is therefore not merely sexual in the narrow sense. It is anti-creational. It assaults the grammar of the world. This helps explain why later texts such as Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2 speak of angels who did not keep their proper place and are reserved for judgment. Neither passage retells Genesis 6 in full. Each uses a compressed warning. Yet both connect rebellion with abandoned station and coming punishment. Jude especially is striking because a few verses later, he cites a prophecy associated with Enoch. That does not settle the whole question of canon, but it does show that early Jewish and Christian readers often linked Enochic tradition with the biblical memory of rebellious powers. The old world was not remembered as innocent and merely unfortunate. It was remembered as invaded by disorder from above and below. Still, it is worth asking what many retellings do with that insight. They often turn forbidden knowledge into the center of attraction. Metallurgy, enchantments, cosmetic arts, astrology, warfare, root cuttings. These appear in Enochic expansions as symbols of corruption, but scripture itself is rarely afraid of knowledge in the abstract. Bezalel receives skill from the Spirit. Solomon asks for wisdom. The sons of Issachar understand the times. The question is not whether people know things. The question is whether knowledge is pursued, apart from reverence, detached from covenant, and aimed at dominion without obedience. Forbidden knowledge is not merely hidden information. It is power untethered from worship. That distinction becomes important when later stories portray women as vessels of illicit transmission. The canonical Bible does contain warnings about seduction, idolatry, sorcery, and false prophecy. Yet it never reduces evil to a secret feminine principle moving beneath history. In fact, when women appear in the flood and post-flood story world, scripture often gives us something quite different. Mothers preserve life. Wives stand inside covenant households. Daughters bear the vulnerability of human society under male power. Deborah, Ruth, Hannah, Abigail, Mary. Across the larger biblical horizon, women are not coded as the privileged carriers of pre-human corruption. Any narrative that makes them so is already leaning more on later fear than on biblical balance. This does not mean later traditions are worthless. It means they must be weighed. Some traditions preserve old questions faithfully. Others expand one shadow until it covers the whole page. Even the Book of Enoch, which is invaluable for understanding Second Temple Jewish thought, functions best when read as witness and interpretation, not as a master key that forces every biblical ambiguity into a single system. It illuminates, it also speculates. Both can be true. Perhaps the deepest issue in this chapter, then, is not whether one can solve every puzzle. It is whether one can feel the ethical charge of the boundary itself. Human beings in Scripture are safest when they receive life as gift. Trouble begins when they try to turn proximity to the divine into an instrument of self-exaltation. Eden reached for wisdom without obedience. Babel reached for height without calling. Genesis 6 reaches for union without order. The shape changes, but the hunger is familiar, and once a boundary is crossed in this way, The damage is rarely limited to the first act. Disorder reproduces itself. It enters memory. It becomes a pattern. What begins in desire ends in a world where violence no longer feels strange. That is why the next movement of the story does not linger on romance or marvel. It moves toward giants, corruption, and the grief that fills the earth before the rain begins. Chapter 3. Giants, renown, and the weight of violence. The Nephilim appear in Genesis like a half-seen shape in early light. The text does not give them a long biography. It gives them a reputation. They are on the earth in those days, and also afterward. They are linked to the union just described. They are remembered as mighty men of old, men of renown. The language is spare, but the atmosphere is heavy. These are not presented as heroes the reader should admire. They belong to a chapter that opens into divine sorrow. Much later, imagination turned the Nephilim into towering monsters, and some ancient Jewish literature certainly develops them in that direction. The Book of 1 Enoch depicts giants whose appetite becomes catastrophic, whose violence spills over creation, and whose death does not end their malign influence. And that is one reading from the Second Temple period, and it became highly influential. Yet even if we set those expansions aside for a moment, Genesis itself already points to a troubling kind of greatness. These are the famous ones, the memorable ones, the people whose names carry force. In the Bible, that can be a sign of blessing, but here it sounds closer to warning. Genesis is skeptical of glory that grows in soil watered by disobedience. The builders of Babel want a name. Pharaoh hardens his heart into monument. Nebuchadnezzar surveys Babylon and speaks as if he built permanence with his own hands. Scripture knows that public magnificence can hide inward rot. So when Genesis introduces men of renown, just before declaring that the earth was filled with violence, it is teaching us how to read prestige. The world often celebrates what God judges. It often remembers the powerful more easily than the righteous. The flood story interrupts that false memory. There is also an important textual tension in the phrase, and also afterward. Afterward when? After the unions? After those days? After the flood? Numbers 13:33 later records the spies claiming to have seen Nephilim in the land, descendants of Enoch, and they describe themselves as grasshoppers by comparison. Some readers take that as proof of a surviving lineage. Others note that the spies are not neutral reporters. They are frightened men whose speech is designed to persuade and panic. The text of Numbers itself later treats their report as deeply compromised. So the later mention keeps the memory alive, but it does not necessarily solve the puzzle. That ambiguity may be deliberate. The Bible is sometimes less interested in satisfying our taxonomy than in exposing our fear. The giant is not only a biological question, it is a theological pressure point. What does Israel do when the world seems populated by powers too old, too large, too established to confront? Again and again, the answer is that covenant faith must refuse scale as the final measure of reality. Giants may exist in history, or in rhetoric, or in collective memory, but they do not decide the future. God does. Before that lesson can mature, however, Genesis takes us into the darkest pre-flood diagnosis in Scripture. The Lord sees that the wickedness of man is great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart is only evil continually. Then comes the shocking language of grief. God is not described as detached. He is grieved to his heart. This is not philosophical evil observed from a distance. This is covenantal sorrow. The maker of life looks upon a world bending everything toward destruction. The flood, then, cannot be reduced to an overreaction against unusual beings. It is a judgment upon comprehensive corruption. Human violence is central. Whatever role the sons of God and the Nephilim play in the narrative, they are folded into a wider condition in which the earth itself is spoiled by the behavior of its inhabitants. That point is crucial because speculative retellings often treat the flood as a surgical strike against hybrid flesh alone. Genesis does not. It presents the flood as the unmaking of a world where violence has become ordinary. This is where Noah becomes important by contrast. The text says Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. He is called righteous and blameless in his generation, and he walks with God. That phrase links him quietly to Enoch. In a culture where renown and appetite dominate, the truly significant people are the walkers, not the conquerors. Noah does not build a tower. He builds an ark in obedience. His importance comes not from spectacle but from trust. The covenant line survives not through the strongest figures in the old world, but through the faithful remnant that listens. There is covenant significance in the flood that should not be missed. The waters are judgment, but they are also a terrible kind of cleansing. Creation is taken back toward its unformed state, not because matter is evil, but because evil has become embedded in creaturely life. Then dry land appears again. A family steps out. God speaks blessing once more. The rainbow is set as a sign that judgment will not have the last word in that form again. The world after the flood is not innocent, but it is re-gifted. That means the story of the Watchers, however one interprets it, is framed by a larger biblical claim. Rebellion can distort the world deeply, but it cannot permanently cancel God's intention to preserve a human future. And yet the flood does not erase memory. Sin remains possible, pride returns, nakedness and shame return. Babel rises not long after. This is one reason some readers reached for Enochic language of lingering spirits, or surviving patterns of corruption. They sensed, rightly, that judgment did not make the human heart automatically whole. Still, the Bible places the emphasis, not on occult residue but on moral continuity. The same race that came through the ark can still rebel. Evil does not need a hidden lineage to reappear. Ordinary humanity is tragically capable of renewing it. That sober truth may be less dramatic than legends of secret inheritance, but it is more piercing. It means the flood is not a story about a bizarre world we can safely distance from ourselves. It is a story about what human society becomes when power, desire, prestige, and fear are left without reverence. The giants are therefore both historical problem and mirror. They reveal what the world admires when it has forgotten what life is for. Perhaps that is why the Bible refuses to romanticize the ancient mighty ones. It leaves them under the sign of judgment. Their renown is remembered, but it is not redeemed. Their size, whether literal or symbolic, does not protect them from the waters. In the end, the ark outlasts the giant because obedience outlasts spectacle. And that prepares the way for a second tradition, built around the quiet man who walked with God, and whose name would later become attached to visions of the Watchers and the coming judgment. Chapter 4, Enoch and the memory of Judgment. Enoch occupies almost no space in Genesis, and yet his shadow grows across centuries. Genesis 5:21-24 tells us that he lived, fathered Methuselah, walked with God for 300 years, and then was taken. That is all. No speeches, no battles, no throne, no detailed farewell. In a genealogy where the tolling phrase is, "and then he died," Enoch stands out by absence. He is the man whose end is not narrated like the others. Scripture does not explain the mechanics. It gives us a relation. He walked with God. That restraint proved fertile. Later Jewish literature asked, what kind of man could be taken by God in this way? And one answer was the literature now gathered under the name 1 Enoch. These writings are not part of the canon for most Jewish and Christian traditions, though they remain canonical in the Ethiopian church. And fragments of Enochic texts were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That matters historically. It shows that Enoch was not a fringe curiosity in the Second Temple world. He was part of a live conversation about judgment, angels, cosmic order, and the fate of the wicked. Still, historical importance is not the same as scriptural status. We should be careful here. The fact that 1 Enoch was influential does not mean every Christian or Jewish community received it as authoritative scripture, nor is it accurate to say It was simply stripped out of the Bible in a single later act because it revealed truths too dangerous to preserve. The story is more complex. Different communities received different collections of sacred books. The Enochic writings circulated widely, were valued deeply in some circles, and survived most fully in Ethiopic. Their preservation is remarkable. Their canonical status has always been disputed, yet even the New Testament shows awareness of Enochic tradition. Jude 14:15 explicitly cites a prophecy attributed to Enoch, the seventh from Adam, announcing the Lord's coming in judgment with holy ones. Jude 6 also speaks of angels who abandoned their proper dwelling and are kept for judgment. 2 Peter 2:4 similarly refers to angels who sinned and were consigned to chains of darkness. These passages do not reproduce the full architecture of one Enoch, but they show that early Christian authors could invoke themes that Enochic literature had made vivid. The world before the flood was remembered not only as morally corrupt, but as a theatre of rebellion that reached into heavenly language. What is striking, however, is how the New Testament uses those themes. It does not do so to satisfy fascination with hidden cosmology. It uses them pastorally and morally. Jude warns against false teachers. Peter warns against corruption and the certainty of judgment. Enoch becomes useful not as an engine of secret knowledge, but as a witness that God does not ignore rebellion, however elevated or impressive the rebel may appear. In that sense, Enoch's enduring function is profoundly biblical. He reminds later readers that history is not self-interpreting. God will name it. There is a beautiful irony here. In some modern retellings, Enoch becomes the doorway to esoteric systems, suppressed archives, and coded bloodlines. But in Genesis, his defining feature is not possession of forbidden mysteries. It is faithful walking, even in later literature where he is shown heavenly visions. The result is not self-exaltation. It is testimony against pride, violence, and cosmic disorder. Enoch is elevated precisely because he does not seize elevation. He is taken. He does not storm heaven. That distinction helps us evaluate the theme of forbidden knowledge more carefully. In Enochic tradition, the Watchers teach arts that deform human life because they are severed from obedience. Knowledge becomes one more expression of taking. By contrast, Enoch receives revelation. He does not raid it. Revelation in Scripture is gift before it is content. That may sound subtle, but it marks the whole moral difference between wisdom and transgression. The rebel wants access without submission. The prophet receives what he is given and bears it as burden. The same contrast appears in the stories that follow the flood. Babel seeks upward movement through unified ambition. Abraham receives a call. Pharaoh builds under coercion. Moses is summoned. Saul grasps for a kingdom. David is anointed. Human ambition keeps trying to cross upward on its own terms. Biblical faith receives vocation from above. Enoch belongs to the second pattern. The Watchers, if that reading is allowed, belong to the first. They do not keep their place. He keeps company with God. There is also a narrative silence around Enoch that later literature tries to fill, and that silence itself is instructive. The Bible does not tell us what Enoch saw in detail. It tells us what sort of man he was. This is an old biblical habit. Character is often given before spectacle. Noah is righteous before the ark is described. Abraham believes before he understands. Mary consents before she sees the shape of all that will follow. The Bible is not opposed to mystery. It is opposed to curiosity detached from obedience. This is one weak point in many competitor-style retellings of Enoch. They are so eager to turn the tradition into a vault of hidden mechanics that they flatten the ethical drama. Angels, women, giants, stars, names, secret rites, preserved lineages. Everything becomes a code to be cracked. But biblical literature is asking a more searching question. What kind of world emerges when created beings refuse place, refuse limit, and refuse gratitude? And what kind of person can still walk with God when such a world becomes normal. Enoch, therefore, stands as more than a name attached to an old book. He stands as a moral counter-image to renown built on force. He has no empire, no army, no monumental city. Yet his memory outlives the mighty. The flood washes away the violent. Enoch's witness remains. Jude still hears him. The scrolls still preserve fragments of his afterlife in tradition. The church still debates him. And all the while Genesis keeps repeating its simplest claim: he walked with God. That may be the most important clue for interpreting every later development. If a retelling of Enoch leaves us more enchanted by cosmic gossip than sobered by judgment, more fascinated with access than shaped by reverence, it has missed the man at the center of the name. And if a reading of the Watchers does not finally return us to humility before the Creator, it has lingered too long among the rebels. Chapter 5. After the waters, the flood ends a world, but it does not end the Bible's interest in what that world left behind. Genesis itself gives us a small but haunting phrase: the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Then much later, as Israel stands at the edge of the promised land, the spies report seeing the descendants of Enoch and call them Nephilim in Numbers 13:33. Their fear is immediate. They feel like grasshoppers in comparison. The land promised by God suddenly feels occupied by something too great to challenge. This is one of the most debated aftershocks in the entire discussion. Did the flood fail to end a literal giant lineage? Did another incursion occur? Is the language of the spies exaggerated, shaped by panic rather than precision? The text does not answer with the neatness modern readers often demand. What it does show with perfect clarity is that memory survived. Israel inherited not only a geography, but a fear vocabulary. Certain peoples were remembered as giant-like, old, formidable, impossible. The Anakim and the Rephaim moved through that atmosphere. Deuteronomy and Joshua preserve some of this memory as well. Og, king of Bashan, becomes a final, giant-like remnant in later recollection, his bedstead held up as tangible evidence of unusual size. Such details ground the tradition in physical imagination. Yet again, the Bible uses the giant motif for more than anthropology. Giants concentrate the question of trust. Will Israel measure the future by what towers before them, or by the God who brought them out of Egypt? When the spies choose fear, their language grows larger than the land itself. That is why the Numbers episode must be read carefully. The statement about Nephilim appears in a report that the narrative later treats as faithless. This does not prove the men saw nothing unusual. It does mean their testimony is not a neutral documentary record. Terror distorts scale. When people surrender imagination to fear, enemies become mythic very quickly. Theologically, that matters. The giant may be real, but fear makes him absolute. Scripture repeatedly works to break that absolutizing habit. There is another aftermath to consider as well. After the flood, humanity remains capable of the same pride that marked the old world. Noah's vineyard scene ends in shame. The table of nations spreads outward. Babel rises as a coordinated attempt to make a name and prevent dispersal. In that sense, the deepest legacy of the pre-flood world is not a traceable supernatural biology, but the durability of human self-exaltation. Even without watchers descending, humanity knows how to recreate rebellion from within. That truth is less dramatic than secret bloodline theories, but it is much more devastating. Indeed, one could argue that Babel is the post-flood counterpart to Genesis 6. In both episodes, creatures resist creaturely limit. In Genesis 6, a boundary is crossed through taking. In Babel, a boundary is crossed through building. In both, the result is a challenge to the order God gives. In both, God intervenes to prevent a corrupted unity from hardening into permanence. The means are different. Water in one case, language in the other, but the moral anatomy is related. This is one place where some traditions of lingering evil try to explain more than the biblical text itself explains. Enochic literature speaks of the spirits of the dead giants becoming oppressive forces. Some later interpreters connect ongoing idolatry, violence, or occult practice to those primeval rebellions. Such readings are significant for the history of interpretation, and they help explain why the Old World remained vivid in Jewish and Christian imagination. But if we are trying to stay anchored, we should say only what the texts justify. The Bible clearly remembers rebellious powers. It clearly remembers giant fear. It clearly remembers post-flood pride. It does not provide a tidy schematic of how every one of those threads joins. Still, the consequences for later biblical history are unmistakable. Israel's conquest narratives, David's battle with Goliath, prophetic condemnations of arrogant kingdoms, and apocalyptic visions of divine judgment all stand in a world where scale and rebellion continue to meet. Goliath is not called a Nephilim, but he belongs to the same biblical theater of threatening size and covenant testing. When David faces him, the story is not about technique defeating mass. It is about the Lord refusing to let the future belong to the armored giant. That is a deeply Genesis-shaped lesson. The Bible's answer to afterward, then, is not to satisfy every hidden chronology. Its answer is covenantal. God continues to preserve a people. He continues to call them away from fear and imitation. He continues to judge the exalted and raise the lowly. The old world's disorder echoes, but it does not reign uncontested. The renown of the mighty keeps resurfacing in new forms, yet God keeps tying hope to figures the world would not naturally choose. Abraham the childless wanderer, Moses the reluctant speaker, David the youngest son, Mary the unnoticed girl of Nazareth. This pattern matters because it quietly overturns the fascination that giant stories can produce. We want to know what survived, what hid, what resurfaced, what secret line remained active beneath empire and tribe. Scripture is usually content to ask something harder. Why does the human heart keep kneeling before scale? Why are we so ready to believe that what is ancient, violent, or impressive must therefore be ultimate? Biblical narrative spends less energy mapping the giant's genealogy than stripping the giant of theological authority. So, yes, the memory survives after the waters. It survives in feared peoples, in debated texts, in scattered traditions, in the language of later warning. But the flood story and everything after it push toward one steady conclusion. The world's great intimidations are real, yet they do not own history. God remains the one who sets bounds, judges rebellion, and keeps covenant even when human memory is full of old terrors. Chapter 6. Night Memories and Human Legends. Once, the biblical story of rebellious powers, strange unions, and giant fear enters history. It does not stay confined to one set of texts. Later cultures remember danger in images of the night, the desert, the forbidden, the untamed feminine, and the voice that lures men toward destruction. This is where comparison becomes tempting and caution becomes necessary. Similarities can illuminate, but they can also mislead. Not every dark female figure in world tradition is a surviving witness to one single pre-flood being. Sometimes traditions preserve memory. Sometimes they preserve metaphor. Sometimes they preserve fear. Take Lilith, often placed at the center of modern discussions. In the canonical Bible, the clearest possible reference is the debated term in Isaiah 34:14, in a judgment oracle against Edom. English translations vary widely. Some render the word as Lilith, others as night creature, night monster, screech owl, or another nocturnal image. That variation alone should make us careful. The verse belongs to a landscape of ruin, inhabited by wild and uncanny things. It may preserve an older demon tradition. It may use mythic language poetically. What it does not do is offer a developed biography of a pre-Eve mother of hidden lineages. That fuller Lilith emerges in later Jewish tradition, where interpretation, folklore, and demonology mingle. Those later traditions are historically important. They show how communities wrestled with vulnerability, sexuality, childbirth, desolation, and the haunting edges of scriptural language. But it is a mistake to read them backward, as if Genesis plainly intended all of it from the beginning. The Bible often leaves a seed that later imagination waters into a forest. Some of that growth is insightful, some of it is defensive, some of it reveals the anxieties of the culture doing the reading. We honor the tradition best by noticing those layers, not by flattening them. The same care is needed when people draw lines from the Watchers to Greek figures such as Medusa or the Sirens, or to Mesopotamian night beings associated with danger and seduction. There are certainly recurring patterns across the ancient world. Beings that blur categories, feminine figures associated with death or untamable power, warnings about beauty joined to destruction, stories in which divine and human realms bleed together. These parallels tell us something important about the religious imagination of old civilizations. They may even suggest that cultures across the Mediterranean and Near East preserved memories of boundary anxiety in related symbolic forms. But parallels are not proof of identity. Medusa is not Lilith in a Greek mask. Sirens are not simply the daughters of the Watchers under another name. Cultural motifs travel, transform, and accumulate new meanings. When interpreters force all such figures into one hidden genealogy, they often produce a story more rigid than the evidence allows. The result can sound thrilling, but it weakens real historical understanding. A quieter approach is stronger. It allows us to say that ancient societies repeatedly imagined danger at the edge of order, often using feminine images, without pretending that all those images come from one recoverable original person. There is also a moral issue underneath these comparisons. Many retellings lean heavily on a pattern in which women become the visible carriers of male transgression. The Watchers rebel, but women become the enduring threat. Male desire breaks boundary, but feminine presence becomes the lasting object of suspicion. Medieval Europe pushed that logic into brutality. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in the late 15th century, codified folklore, demonology, and legal cruelty into a handbook that helped fuel centuries of witch hunting. Women who knew herbs, midwifery, seasonal rhythms, or simply lived under communal suspicion could be recast as agents of hidden evil. That history should sober any attempt to build a straight line from Genesis 6 to witch trials. There are connections of imagination, certainly. Christian Europe read the Bible through inherited fears about demons, illicit knowledge, sexual temptation, and nocturnal threats. But the witch hunts were also shaped by social panic, misogyny, judicial torture, confessional conflict, and local grievance. To say that inquisitors were still fighting the daughters of the Watchers is rhetorically powerful and historically weak. It explains too much too quickly. The biblical narrative itself gives us a better discipline. It refuses to make womanhood the secret essence of corruption. Eve sins, yes, but so does Adam, and the curse falls across human relations together. Sarah bears promise in weakness. Miriam sings deliverance. Ruth binds herself to covenant. Esther risks herself for her people. Mary receives the word with faith. The daughters of men in Genesis 6 are not developed as occult transmitters. They are caught within a scene of taking. That difference should not be erased by later fascination. Even the theme of forbidden knowledge needs to be untangled from panic. Ancient and medieval societies often feared specialized knowledge when it sat outside recognized institutions. Astrology, metallurgy, healing arts, dream interpretation, and ritual expertise could all look suspicious. The Enochic tradition dramatized some of these arts as corrupt gifts of rebellious watchers. That is a meaningful symbolic judgment on power, detached from God. Yet historically, not every woman accused of strange knowledge was preserving antediluvian secrets. Much of what was punished as witchcraft was ordinary skill, village medicine, or projected fear. So what do these later legends preserve, if not a neat secret lineage? They preserve the afterlife of biblical tension. They show that once a culture absorbs stories of rebellion from above, dangerous beauty, giant violence, desert desolation, and coming judgment, it continues to imagine the world through those categories. Ruins feel inhabited, night feels morally charged, the border between seen and unseen feels unstable. The feminine may be idealized as bearer of wisdom or feared as doorway to loss. These are not trivial motifs. They reveal how deeply the old scriptural dramas entered memory. But the Bible itself keeps calling us back from overreach. It grants mystery without demanding system. It leaves dark edges in place without requiring that every shadow be given a proper name. It lets Isaiah speak of desolate places where uncanny creatures rest. It lets Jude remember angels who abandoned their station. It lets Genesis preserve 4 difficult verses before the flood. Yet it never commands us to build an all-explaining mythology out of those fragments. That restraint is not a weakness. It is a protection. It keeps the reader from becoming intoxicated with symbols. It keeps fear from posing as revelation. It keeps the story centered on the holiness of God, the vulnerability of the human world, and the recurring temptation to cross limits rather than trust them. Legends may gather around those themes for centuries. Some will be wise, some will be cruel. All of them are best read under the steady light of Scripture rather than in place of it. Chapter 7. The limits that keep life whole by the end of this long trail. From Genesis to Enochic tradition, from flood memory to giant fear, from Isaiah's night language to medieval panic, the deepest issue is no longer the identity of every figure. It is the meaning of limit. The Bible begins with a world made habitable. By separations God calls good. Waters abounded. Lights are appointed. Creatures are given kinds. Humanity is made from the dust and entrusted with rule under God, not independent of Him. To be a creature in that world is not humiliation, it is blessing. The tragedy of Genesis 6 is that limit comes to be treated as something to violate rather than receive. Whether one emphasizes angelic rebellion, tyrannical rulers, or both layers at once, the action in the passage refuses creaturely contentment. Seeing becomes taking, distinction becomes material for appetite, renown becomes attractive, even when it grows in violent soil. And once that pattern ripens, the whole earth feels its effect. This is why the flood story is not really about curiosity at the edges of the text. It is about what happens when a world no longer trusts the wisdom of its boundaries. That lesson remains painfully current. Human beings still believe that power justifies access. We still treat the hidden as holy, merely because it is hidden. We still assume that if knowledge can be obtained, it should be. We still mistake the impressive for the legitimate. We still turn fear into mythology and mythology into accusation. The old stories remain alive because the old temptation remains alive. We do not need a surviving Nephilim bloodline to explain our capacity for distortion. We carry enough of Babel and enough of pre-flood violence in ordinary history already. Yet the biblical answer is not paranoia, it is reverent order. Noah builds under command. Abraham leaves under promise. Israel is given law so that life can be shaped instead of seized. Wisdom literature teaches that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, which means true understanding begins not with possession, but with posture. Even revelation itself comes this way. Moses removes sandals, Isaiah is undone before he is sent. Mary receives before she bears. The way of God is never take from any you choose. It is hear, receive, obey. This is also why the contrast between Enoch and the mighty ones matters so much. The world remembers renown loudly. God remembers faithfulness deeply. The Nephilim are a rumor of strength under judgment. Enoch is a quiet life under favor. One path seeks enlargement of self, the other consents to fellowship with God. One leaves behind violence and fear, the other leaves behind witness. And across the Bible, it is always the second path that proves durable, even when the first seems more impressive for a time. There is a covenant seriousness here that should not be softened. God judges what destroys life. The flood, the chains of darkness in Jude and Peter, the ruins of Edom in Isaiah, the fall of proud kingdoms, the final judgment announced across Scripture. All of these testify that rebellion is not endlessly tolerated. The world is not abandoned to those who cross boundaries and then call the wreckage wisdom. This is one reason the old stories retain their weight. They insist that moral structure is built into reality. Violence against creation is never merely symbolic. It ripens toward judgment. At the same time, biblical judgment is never the whole word. After the flood comes covenant. After Babel comes the call of Abraham. After giant fear comes the defeat of Goliath. After exile come promises of return. After the long history of human and spiritual rebellion comes Christ, who does not seize equality with God as a thing to exploit, but empties himself and becomes obedient unto death. In that light, the Watcher's tradition, however one interprets its details, stands in profound contrast to the gospel. Where rebellion grasps upward, the Son descends in humility. Where illicit power takes, divine love gives. Where the old world filled the earth with violence, the kingdom comes through suffering obedience. This Christological horizon does not erase the old mysteries, but it does place them. The question is no longer whether hidden forces once sought to corrupt the human story. The question is whether God has left the story vulnerable to them forever. The New Testament's answer is no. Principalities and powers remain real, but they are not ultimate. Judgment remains coming, but mercy has also entered history decisively. The serpent's world of distortion is answered not by greater secrecy, but by incarnation, cross and resurrection. Seen from that height, many sensational retellings begin to look smaller than they first appeared. They promise access to buried lines, suppressed archives, and lost female mysteries. But Scripture is aiming at a more searching freedom. It wants to cure the heart's appetite for transgressive elevation. It wants to teach us to love the good limits that keep life human. It wants us to recognize that not every secret deserves pursuit, not every power deserves admiration, and not every old memory deserves a mythology built around it. That is why the most faithful ending to this subject is not a dramatic unveiling, but a sober return. We return to Genesis and let its difficulty remain difficult. We return to Enoch and receive it as a significant ancient witness without forcing it into places it does not securely hold. We return to Jude and Peter and hear their warning about rebellion and judgment. We return to Isaiah and let desolation speak in images appropriate to ruin. We return to history and refuse to baptize cruelty by calling it discernment. And we return above all to the God who sets boundaries not to starve life, but to preserve it. If this reflection stays with you, you may wish to sit with those early chapters of Genesis again, not as a code to unlock, but as a mirror and a warning. They ask what kind of beings we become when we no longer receive our place with gratitude. They also ask whether we still believe that walking with God is greater than being remembered by the world. The old stories of watchers, giants, and haunted memory endure because they touch a real human fear that evil may enter history in ways larger than we can manage. The biblical answer is neither denial nor obsession. It is faithful seriousness. Evil is real, judgment is real, mystery is real, but so is covenant, so is mercy, so is the quiet endurance of those who walk with God while renown rises and falls around them. In the end, that is the truest legacy in this field of shadows, not the fame of the mighty, but the path of the faithful.